There is a room. It exists in many countries under many flags. Sometimes it is in the damp, stone-walled basement of a government building, echoing with the ghosts of past regimes. Sometimes it is in a prefabricated hut on a remote military base, baking under a desert sun that seems to bleach all morality from the landscape. Sometimes it is in a nondescript warehouse on the anonymous edge of a city, a place you drive past every day without a second thought. The details change, the architecture of cruelty shifts with the times, but the purpose is always the same. Inside this room, the normal rules of human interaction, the intricate web of empathy and social contract that holds our civilization together, are deliberately and systematically suspended. One human being is given absolute power over another, and they are tasked with inflicting pain. They might use electricity or water or stress positions, or simply the crushing, invisible weight of isolation and fear. But the method is secondary. The true mystery of this room is not what happens there, but why. For centuries, we have told ourselves a simple, comforting story about torture. We have said it is the work of monsters, of aberrant personalities, of sadists who exist on the far fringes of humanity and delight in the suffering of others. It is a comforting story because it places the torturer outside the bounds of normal human experience. It creates a neat, clean line between us, the good, moral people, and them, the inhuman psychopaths. It allows us to believe that we, as ordinary individuals, are fundamentally incapable of such acts. But what if that story is a lie? A necessary fiction we tell ourselves to sleep at night? What if the most chilling truth about modern torture is not that it is performed by monsters, but that it is often performed by ordinary men and women? People who go home to their families, who worry about their mortgages, who coach their children's sports teams, who fret about the same daily trivialities that we all do. People who, through a series of powerful and often subtle psychological and social pressures, have been transformed into instruments of state-sponsored cruelty. Today, we are not going to focus on the what of torture, the gruesome catalog of horrors, but the why. This is a journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche and the social structures that exploit it. We will explore the dark psychology that allows an ordinary person to cross the Rubicon and become a torturer. We will examine the historical persistence of this practice, asking why, despite international laws, moral condemnation, and a supposed arc of human progress, modern torture refuses to die. This is not a story about devices and techniques. It is a story about obedience, dehumanization, ideology, cognitive dissonance, and the terrifying ease with which the line between civilization and barbarism can be erased. We will ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Under the right circumstances, what are any of us capable of? To begin to understand the why of modern torture, we must first confront a series of landmark psychological experiments that shattered our comfortable illusions about human nature. These experiments, conducted in the mid-20th century, were not about torture themselves, but they laid bare the psychological mechanisms that make torture possible. The first, and perhaps most famous, is the Milgram experiment. In 1961, just a few months after the trial of the high-ranking Nazi SS officer Adolf Eichmann began in Jerusalem, a Yale University psychologist named Stanley Milgram set out to understand the nature of obedience to authority. The world was transfixed by Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistics. He was not a frothing-at-the-mouth fanatic, but a bland, bespectacled bureaucrat. His defense was that he was not a monster, but a functionary, a man who was simply following orders. Milgram, a Jewish man whose family had been deeply affected by the Holocaust, wanted to test this. Could an ordinary American citizen be ordered to inflict pain on an innocent person? The setup was a masterpiece of psychological stagecraft. Volunteers were recruited for a supposed memory and learning experiment at the prestigious Yale University, the location itself lending an air of legitimacy to the proceedings. They were assigned the role of teacher, and were seated in front of an imposing shock generator with a series of 30 switches, labeled with voltages ranging from 15 volts, slight shock, to 450 volts, triple X. Their task was to administer an electric shock to a learner in another room every time the learner got a question wrong, increasing the voltage with each error. The learner, of course, was an actor, a mild-mannered and likable 47-year-old accountant named Mr. Wallace, and the shocks were not real. But the teacher did not know this. To convince them, they were given a sample shock of 45 volts at the beginning, a painful jolt that established the machine's reality. As the voltage increased, the actor in the other room would begin to protest according to a prearranged script. At 75 volts, a grunt. At 120, a shout of pain. At 150, he would cry out, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I won't be in the experiment anymore. I refuse to go on," and complain of a heart condition. At 300 volts, he would let out an agonized scream and refuse to answer any more questions. Then, at the highest voltages, he would fall silent, as if he had lost consciousness or died. If the teacher hesitated, an experimenter in a white lab coat, the embodiment of calm, scientific authority would calmly instruct them to continue with a series of 4 standardized prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice, you must go on. Before the experiment, Milgram polled his colleagues, psychiatrists at Yale. They predicted that only a tiny fraction of participants, perhaps 1 in 1,000, the sadistic fringe, would go all the way to 450 volts. The reality was horrifying. In the most well-known variation of the experiment, a full 65% of participants, 2 out of every 3 ordinary people from New Haven, Connecticut, obeyed the authority figure and administered the maximum potentially fatal shock. They were not happy about it. They sweated, they trembled, they laughed nervously. They argued with the experimenter. They showed extreme signs of internal conflict and stress. But they obeyed. Milgram ran numerous variations to test the boundaries of obedience. When the experiment was moved from Yale to a rundown office building, obedience dropped, but only to 48%, still shockingly high. When the authority figure gave orders by phone instead of being in the room, obedience plummeted to 21%. And in the most hopeful variation, when the teacher was paired with 2 other Confederate teachers, who refused to continue, 90% of the real participants also found the strength to defy the experimenter. The Milgram experiment revealed a powerful and deeply unsettling truth. The deep-seated human tendency to obey authority, even when it means violating our own moral conscience. Milgram called this the agentic state, a state of mind where an individual sees themselves not as an autonomous actor, but as an agent for executing the wishes of another person. In this state, the sense of personal responsibility is diminished and outsourced to the authority figure. This is the first crucial pillar of the psychology of torture. The torturer is rarely acting alone. They are acting as an agent of a higher authority, the state, the military, the party which tells them that what they are doing is not only permissible but necessary. But obedience alone is not enough. To inflict pain on another human being over a prolonged period, you must first stop seeing them as a human being. This is the process of dehumanization, and its power was chillingly demonstrated in another landmark study, the Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to understand how the power of a situation can shape behavior. He created a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building and recruited a group of healthy, psychologically normal male college students who had responded to a newspaper ad. He randomly assigned them to be either prisoners or guards. The transformation was terrifyingly rapid. The experiment began with a shocking dose of reality for the prisoners. They were arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers, charged with a felony, read their rights, handcuffed and driven to the prison, where they were stripped naked, deloused, and given their new identity, a number. They were made to wear ill-fitting smocks without underwear, and a chain was locked around one ankle, a constant physical reminder of their imprisonment. The guards, given khaki uniforms, reflective sunglasses that masked their eyes and created a sense of anonymity, and wooden batons as symbols of power, quickly began to embrace their role. Within a day, they were exhibiting authoritarian and abusive behavior. On the second day, the prisoners rebelled, barricading themselves in their cells. The guards responded with overwhelming force, spraying them with fire extinguishers, breaking into the cells, stripping the prisoners naked, and putting the ringleaders into solitary confinement. They became creative in their cruelty. They subjected the prisoners to psychological humiliation, forcing them to perform push-ups as punishment, and using sleep deprivation by waking them in the middle of the night for counts that would last for hours. The prisoners, in turn, became passive, helpless, and emotionally distressed. They began to internalize their role, showing signs of what psychologists call learned helplessness. Prisoner 8612 had a breakdown after only 36 hours, screaming with rage and uncontrollable crying. Others followed. The experiment, which was supposed to last 2 weeks, had to be shut down after only 6 days. The catalyst was an outsider, a fellow psychologist named Christina Maslach, who was dating Zimbardo at the time. When she saw the prisoners being marched to the toilet, bags over their heads, legs chained, she was horrified and confronted Zimbardo, telling him, "What you are doing to these boys is terrible." It was this outside perspective that finally broke the spell and made Zimbardo realize that he too had been sucked into his role as prison superintendent, prioritizing security over the well-being of the student participants. The Stanford Prison Experiment, though facing modern criticism for its methodology, demonstrated the incredible power of social roles and situational forces. The guards were not sadists. They were ordinary students who had been given a role, a uniform, and unchecked power over others. The uniform became a mask, a permission slip to act in ways they never would have in normal life. The experiment also highlighted the mechanism of dehumanization. It is infinitely easier to be cruel to a number, an object, or a member of a despised group than it is to be cruel to a person with a name, a family, and a story. This is the second crucial pillar of the psychology of torture. The victim is labeled as a terrorist, a subversive, an infidel, or an enemy combatant. They are stripped of their humanity, making it psychologically possible for the torturer to inflict pain without feeling the full weight of their actions. Milgram showed us obedience. Zimbardo showed us dehumanization. Together, they provide the basic psychological blueprint for how an ordinary person can be turned into a torturer. With this psychological blueprint in mind, we can now examine how real-world systems of torture are constructed. It is never a random or haphazard process. It is a carefully engineered system, a social and psychological production line designed to recruit, train, and socialize individuals into the role of the torturer. This process can be broken down into several distinct stages. A journey into darkness. The first stage is screening and selection. Authoritarian regimes and intelligence agencies do not simply pick people off the street. They look for specific traits. Ironically, they often do not look for sadists or psychopaths. Such individuals can be unpredictable, difficult to control, and may enjoy the work too much, which can be a liability. Instead, they often look for people who are loyal, disciplined, and deferential to authority. They look for individuals who have a strong us versus them mentality, people who are easily convinced of the righteousness of their in-group and the inherent evil of the out-group. Military personnel, police officers, and those from strong nationalist or ideological backgrounds are often prime candidates. They are people who are already socialized to follow orders and believe in the mission of the state. There is also an appeal to patriotism, a sense of being chosen for a vital, secret task that is essential to the nation's survival. The recruitment process itself is often framed as an honor, an entry into an elite unit. The second stage is initiation and training. This is where the process of moral disengagement, a term coined by psychologist Albert Bandura, begins in earnest. The training often takes place in a secret, isolated location, cut off from the outside world and its conflicting moral messages. This creates an intense, all-encompassing social environment, a total institution, where the only values that matter are those of the organization. The training itself is a mixture of brutal physical hazing and intense ideological indoctrination. The hazing builds group cohesion and a sense of shared hardship, forging bonds through common suffering. The indoctrination relentlessly drills home the idea that the enemy is less than human, that they pose an existential threat to the nation, to their families, to their way of life. The recruit is taught to see the world in black and white. We are good, they are evil. During this stage, the language of torture is systematically sanitized. Brutal acts are given euphemistic, bureaucratic names. Waterboarding becomes the water technique. Electric shocks become the telephone. Stress positions become physical pressure or conditioning. At the School of the Americas, a U.S. military training facility for Latin American soldiers, manuals taught coercive counterintelligence interrogation, never torture. This language is not accidental. It is a psychological tool that distances the perpetrator from the reality of their actions. It reframes the act, transforming a violent, intimate act of cruelty into a technical, professional procedure. The trainee is not learning to hurt people. They are learning to apply a technique, conduct an interrogation, or gather intelligence. This linguistic detoxification is crucial for overcoming moral barriers. The third stage is the first act. This is a critical psychological threshold. The first time a new torturer participates in an act of cruelty, it is often a moment of crisis. But they are not alone. They are surrounded by veteran torturers, their superiors, who model the desired behavior and provide social proof that this is normal and acceptable. Often, the newcomer is given a minor role at first, holding the victim down, passing a tool, guarding the door before they are required to inflict pain themselves. This gradual escalation, this slippery slope of participation, makes it easier to overcome moral inhibitions. Once that first line has been crossed, it becomes progressively easier to cross it again. The act itself becomes a powerful tool of self-justification. To admit that what they did was wrong would be to admit they are a bad person. It is psychologically easier to convince themselves that what they did was necessary and that the victim deserved it. This is a way of reducing cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when holding contradictory beliefs. The final stage is routinization and normalization. Torture becomes a job. It becomes a mundane, daily routine. The torturers go to work, they process a certain number of detainees, they write their reports, and they go home. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. This routinization is the final and most powerful defense against empathy and guilt. The act is stripped of its moral significance and becomes simply a task to be completed. Survivors of torture often comment on the terrifying banality of their tormentors, who might chat about sports or their family problems while inflicting unimaginable pain. This is what the political theorist Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil when observing Adolf Eichmann. It is not the evil of demonic monsters, but the evil of thoughtless functionaries, of cogs in a bureaucratic machine of pain. This systematic process selection, indoctrination, gradual escalation, and routinization is how the state manufactures torturers. It is a social and psychological assembly line for cruelty. Now that we understand the psychological mechanisms and the social systems that create torturers, we must ask a larger question. Why does this practice persist? Why, in an age of international human rights law and global condemnation, does modern torture refuse to die? The answer is not simple. It lies in a complex interplay of political ideology, institutional dynamics, legal maneuvering, and the powerful, seductive logic of fear. This is the historical persistence of a dark art. One of the most powerful drivers of modern torture is ideology. In the 20th century, the great totalitarian ideologies of communism and fascism provided a fertile ground for state-sponsored cruelty. In these systems, the individual has no inherent worth. Their value is determined solely by their utility to the state or their loyalty to the party. The enemy, the class enemy, the racial enemy, the political dissident is not just wrong. They are a contagion, a biological or social threat to the purity and progress of the nation. Torture, in this context, is not merely a tool for extracting information. It is a tool for ideological enforcement. It is a ritual of purification, a way to force the enemy to confess their crimes against the people, to recant their heretical beliefs, and to reaffirm the absolute power and truth of the state's ideology. The show trials of Stalin's Soviet Union, where loyal old Bolsheviks would stand up and confess to absurd plots of spying for foreign powers, were the public culmination of this process. The torture that happened in the basement of the Lubyanka prison was designed to produce not just a confession, but a performance of submission for the entire world to see. This ideological driver did not disappear with the fall of fascism and communism. It has been replaced by new ideologies. In the late 20th century, many authoritarian regimes, particularly in Latin America, adopted the national security doctrine. Promoted during the Cold War as a bulwark against communism, this doctrine held that the nation was under constant threat from internal subversion. This created a state of permanent, low-grade warfare where the military was justified in using any means necessary, including torture and disappearance, to eliminate this internal enemy. The subversive replaced the class enemy as the dehumanized target. Torture became a tool of social control, used to terrorize any opposition and maintain the power of the ruling elite. In the 21st century, the war on terror has provided a new and powerful ideological justification. The terrorist has become the ultimate dehumanized figure, an embodiment of pure, irrational evil who operates outside the laws of war and civilization. This ideology argues that because the enemy is so barbaric, we are justified in using barbaric methods against them. This creates a moral feedback loop. The more monstrous we believe the enemy to be, the more monstrous our own actions are permitted to become. The historical persistence of modern torture is, in part, a story of its ideological adaptability. It latches onto the dominant political fears of the era and presents itself as a necessary, if unpleasant, solution. Beyond ideology, there is the powerful force of institutional self-preservation. Once a state or an agency begins to use torture, it creates a powerful bureaucracy whose own survival, budget, and influence depend on the continuation of the practice. The CIA's Enhanced Interrogation Program is a perfect case study. After September 11th, the agency was under immense pressure to produce intelligence. They invested heavily in the program, building secret black sites, hiring contractors like the psychologists Mitchell and Jessen for tens of millions of dollars, and developing their techniques. This created an institutional imperative to prove that the program was working. Reports sent up the chain of command to the White House and Congress consistently exaggerated the value of the intelligence obtained through these harsh methods. They cherry-picked successes and ignored failures. They created a narrative of ticking time bombs thwarted and lives saved. To admit that the program was ineffective or that the intelligence was unreliable would have been to admit a catastrophic failure. It would have exposed the agency to legal and political consequences. So, the institution had a vested interest in perpetuating the myth of torture's effectiveness. The torture continued not necessarily because it was working, but because the bureaucracy needed it to be seen as working. This is a classic example of institutional momentum. A dark practice, once started, develops its own logic and its own constituency, making it incredibly difficult to stop. This leads us to a crucial point often lost in the emotional debate: the profound ineffectiveness of torture as an intelligence-gathering tool. The popular image is of a spy who, under duress, gives up the secret code. The reality is that a person under extreme pain and psychological stress is the least reliable source of information imaginable. Their higher cognitive functions shut down. Memory becomes fragmented and unreliable. Their sole motivation is to make the pain stop. This means they will say anything they think the torturer wants to hear. They will confess to crimes they didn't commit. They will invent plots. They will implicate innocent people. The classic example is the case of Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, a detainee captured after September 11th. Under threat of torture, he fabricated a story about a link between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, specifically about chemical and biological weapons training. This piece of false intelligence, extracted through coercion, was cited by Secretary of State Colin Powell in his 2003 speech to the United Nations, forming a key part of the public justification for the Iraq War. Torture did not prevent a tragedy. It helped create one. The persistence of torture, therefore, cannot be explained by its utility. It must be explained by other, darker motivations. One of these is the legal architecture of impunity. Modern torture often thrives in legal black holes, spaces deliberately created to be outside the reach of normal law. The Guantanamo Bay detention camp is the prime example. It was chosen specifically because its unique legal status as a U.S. naval base on leased Cuban land was thought to place it beyond the jurisdiction of U.S. federal courts. The prisoners there were designated not as prisoners of war, who would be protected by the Geneva Conventions, but as unlawful enemy combatants, a new legal category invented to strip them of rights. This legal maneuvering, epitomized by the infamous torture memos written by lawyers in the Department of Justice, is a key feature of modern state torture. It is an attempt to create a legal force field around the practice, to make it technically not torture under a contorted definition of the law, and thus to provide legal cover for those who authorize and carry it out. Finally, and perhaps most powerfully, there is the social psychology of fear and vengeance. Torture rarely happens in times of peace and security. It flourishes in times of crisis, war, and intense national anxiety. After a major attack like 9/11, a society can be gripped by a collective fear that overrides its normal ethical commitments. The public demands security. They demand that the government do whatever it takes to protect them. This creates a permissive social environment for torture. Political leaders can then exploit this fear. They can frame the debate as a stark choice between being tough on terror or being weak and naive. But beyond fear, there is a deep-seated human desire for retribution. After a national trauma, there is a powerful public desire for vengeance. In this context, torture can serve a purpose that has nothing to do with intelligence. It becomes a ritual of degradation, a way to inflict suffering on a dehumanized enemy as payback for the suffering they have inflicted. It is a performance of dominance. The photographs from Abu Ghraib, showing prisoners being sexually humiliated and stacked in pyramids, were not about gathering information. They were about power, degradation, and a perverse form of retributive justice. The historical persistence of torture is therefore not just about political will. It is about public will, a will that is shaped and manipulated by fear, fiction, and a primal desire for vengeance. So, we have seen how ordinary people can be turned into torturers. We have seen how the practice is perpetuated by ideology, bureaucracy, and fear. But there is one final, crucial element to this dark psychology: the effect of torture on the torturer themselves. We often focus on the suffering of the victim, and rightly so, but the act of inflicting pain also leaves a deep and lasting scar on the perpetrator. This is a truth that is often overlooked. To be a torturer is to live in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. It is to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. I am a good person, and I inflict unspeakable pain on other human beings. The psychological gymnastics required to reconcile these two ideas are immense. Some torturers cope through doubling. As described by the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton in his study of Nazi doctors, they create a torturer self or an Auschwitz self that is separate from their normal self. The torturer self is the one who goes to work in the prison, who is capable of cruelty. The normal self is the one who goes home, who plays with their children, who is a loving spouse. This psychological split allows them to function, but it is a fragile defense. Others cope through extreme ideological commitment. They convince themselves so thoroughly of the enemy's evil and the righteousness of their cause that they feel no guilt. They see their work as a noble, if difficult, duty. But for many, these defenses eventually crumble. The constant exposure to human suffering, the screams, the fear, the degradation, it takes a toll. Many former torturers suffer from what is now being called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, or PITS. They experience many of the same symptoms as their victims: PTSD, depression, anxiety, flashbacks, and substance abuse. They are haunted by what they have seen and what they have done. The act of destroying another person's humanity inevitably corrodes one's own. The Greek torturer from the time of the military junta, who testified anonymously in the documentary The Laughing Man, spoke of how he could no longer look at his own hands without seeing them as instruments of pain. Eric Lomax, a British officer who was tortured by the Japanese during World War II, wrote in his memoir, "Sometime the hating has to stop." The story of his eventual reconciliation with one of his tormentors is a powerful testament to this idea. The perpetrator, in many ways, remains as much a prisoner of the torture chamber as the victim. What, then, can we conclude from this journey into the dark psychology of modern torture? We have learned that torture is not the product of a few evil monsters. It is the product of powerful situational and systemic forces. It is the end result of a process that leverages our deep-seated tendencies towards obedience and tribalism, a process that dehumanizes the victim and provides the perpetrator with a powerful ideological justification. We have learned that the historical persistence of this practice is not an accident, but a feature of political systems that thrive on ideology, bureaucracy, and fear. This understanding is not meant to absolve the individual torturer of responsibility. They make a choice and they must be held accountable for that choice. But it does complicate our understanding. It forces us to look beyond the individual and at the systems that create them. A few bad apples is always the first and easiest explanation for an atrocity like Abu Ghraib. But the psychological and historical evidence suggests that the problem is rarely the apples. The problem is the barrel. The problem is the social and political context that makes such atrocities not just possible, but predictable. This knowledge is profoundly unsettling because it means that the capacity for such cruelty does not reside in a small, monstrous minority. It resides dormant in all of us. The Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment were not about them. They were about us. They were a mirror held up to our own human nature. They showed us that the right combination of authority, ideology, and social pressure can make ordinary people do extraordinary evil. This is why the fight against torture must be waged not just in courtrooms and through international treaties, but in our own societies and our own minds. It requires the cultivation of critical thinking and a healthy skepticism of authority. It requires the relentless defense of empathy and the constant effort to see the humanity in others, especially our perceived enemies. It requires the rejection of fear-mongering and the courage to uphold our moral principles, especially when it is most difficult to do so. The history of modern torture is a long and brutal one, but it is also a history of resistance, of those who refused to obey, who blew the whistle, who refused to be complicit, who insisted on the non-negotiable dignity of every human being. The historical persistence of torture is a testament to the darkness we are capable of. The persistent struggle against it is a testament to the light. Thank you for joining us on this deep and difficult exploration. The psychology behind modern torture is a subject that challenges our most basic assumptions about ourselves and our world. If you found this investigation valuable, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future deep dives into the hidden corners of history and the human mind. And we want to hear your perspective. What, in your opinion, is the single most powerful factor that allows an ordinary person to become a torturer? Obedience to authority, the dehumanization of the victim, or ideological belief? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This is a vital conversation, and your voice is a part of it. Thank you for listening.